Hello, travelers. Welcome to Reach the World STEM Week. For over 20 years, Reach the World has inspired youth to become curious, confident, and compassionate global citizens via virtual exchange. My name is Tim, and as part of Reach the World's efforts to support educators and families during the COVID-19 pandemic, we are using the power of Zoom to share free live stream events with members of our global community. You can find a complete listing of upcoming events, great at-home learning resources, and much more on our website, athome.reachtheworld.org. But today, I hope you're ready to go on a journey deep into the lost forest of Madagascar with explorer and researcher Mai Fami. Mai is a member of the prestigious Explorers Club. She lives in Queens, New York, and she recently returned from an incredible expedition to Madagascar. She's with us today to tell us all about her adventures and answer your questions. After today's call, you can keep the expedition going by visiting Mai's Virtual Exchange homepage. We'll share a link in the YouTube chat bar in just a moment. And to our live stream viewers, welcome. The YouTube chat bar is the perfect way to let us know you're here and share any questions you have for Mai. We want to hear from you, and we'll get to as many of your questions as possible today. But without further delay, I think it's time to go on a virtual journey to Madagascar. Welcome to Reach the World, Mai.
Hi, thank you for having me.
You bet. It's great to have you here today. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm a PhD student and I work on leeches. That's what I'm studying for my dissertation. And I am using leeches to survey biodiversity in the most endangered forests in the world, arguably, and that is those of Madagascar. So it's basically my job to travel to Madagascar and collect hundreds and hundreds of leeches. And then I bring them back to New York to analyze them. And yeah, it's a lot of fun.
Fantastic. I know you've got some pictures you want to show us of your expedition.
Absolutely. So I would like to give you sort of an overview of my most recent expedition, which happened back in November. And I'm just going to share my screen with you to take you along on this journey. So back in November, I went to Madagascar. I was there for 5 weeks and I ventured into the lost forest. And I'll get more into that later in my presentation. But first, I'd like to give you a bit of background about my research. So my PhD is concerned with protecting and conserving biodiversity. Now, what is biodiversity and why is it important? Biodiversity is basically the variety of all the plants and animals on Earth. And that variety is really important because it provides food security, it regulates our climate, it keeps our air clean, it acts as a buffer to infectious disease, such as, the coronavirus that we're seeing right now. And it also provides a lot of benefits, both in the medical and pharmaceutical fields, as well as culturally, spiritually, and personally for a lot of people around the world. And so I do my part to protect biodiversity by using leeches. So leeches feed on the blood of other animals, and by analyzing their gut contents, I can figure out which animals live in the forest that I've collected them from. And so I do this by walking through the forests and collecting leeches, bringing them back to the US, where I chop up their guts and I can extract the DNA from those guts. And similarly to forensics, I can figure out sort of what the leeches had fed on, and that'll tell me what critters live in the forest. And so I do this in one of the most biodiverse regions in the world, and that is Madagascar. So it's an island off of the southeast coast of Africa. It's about the size of Texas, and about 90% of the original forest cover has been lost over the years, and that's due to logging. About 90% of all species found here are endemic, which means they're found nowhere else in the world. And the majority of those species, unfortunately, rely on these shrinking habitats. And so I went to the Lost Forest, which is located in south central Madagascar. You see here on my map. And this site has been rumored to contain a really unusual collection of animals. And so there had been previous expeditions in 2016 and 2017 to this site where researchers discovered that there were really bizarre species, ones from the western spiny forest, the dry forests living in this rainforest, and from the eastern regions living in the central region, and all the way from the southern beaches. And so this forest really, it houses a really unique collection of animals. And so it wasn't enough for researchers to just go in and try to figure out what lives there themselves. Really what they needed were some leeches to be collected out of this region so that we could really figure out all the different really well camouflaged species, those species that are really difficult to spot by people, and species that are often hard to capture even with technology like camera traps. So that's where my research comes in. And so this is an image of the Lost Forest from afar. It's this dark shadow sort of in the middle of this mountain. And I was wondering if anyone sort of has any observations about this photo, about the clouds in this photo. Does anyone want to give a couple of guesses?
Ooh, that's a great question. We've got a great group of students on the YouTube chat bar today. If anybody in our audience today wants to make an observation, please feel free to add it to the live chat bar, and I'll add those for you, or I'll flag those for you when they come in.
Yeah. So I'll give everyone a second, but the forest is right in the middle right here. And if no one has any guesses, I can go ahead and share with you what's so interesting about this picture.
I'm sure. Why don't we let the viewers think of it in their head, and then maybe you can confirm or deny.
Okay. Yeah. So what's happening in this picture is you'll notice that the clouds exist only over the forest. Pretty much this landscape has been burned to the ground. And so the only moisture that's left in the environment is that's over the remaining forest. And so what people don't really realize is that when trees are removed, you're not only destroying habitat for the creatures that live there, but you're also depriving people of water. And that's because trees release water just through photosynthesis, and that water rises and forms clouds. And obviously the clouds release that condensation as rain. And so you'll find in areas that have been deforested, there are often pretty severe famines that occur. And that's because once you remove trees, you really eliminate a people's source of water.
We've got a very sharp audience today in the YouTube chat. They have guessed. Donna says the clouds are on top of the mountains. Sadie says the clouds are only by the forest. I think they were right.
You got it. You got it. So the journey to the Lost Forest was a 3-hour hike at an incline, basically up that mountain that you just saw. And it was pretty grueling. And all along our hike, we were surrounded by this really barren landscape that had just been burned through several times a year, year after year. So there's very little growing out here. And it really felt like the surface of Mars at time, where we're just surrounded by these rocks and gravel. And it's, while you're hiking, there's sort of, you don't believe that there's going to be a forest at the end. It's kind of the last thing you expect to see. But sure enough, you hear the forest before you see it. And so I hope you can hear this audio. This is actually audio upon arriving at the forest at the top of that last ridge that I had crossed. And you get up to the top and you hear the birds. You hear the birds first, and then you see the mist coming, rolling down from the trees. And you get up on that ridge and you see that sea of green stretch out below. And this forest is kind of miraculous that it's still intact, because like I said, those fires are burning through the region so regularly, but This forest has remained preserved because it exists sort of in the middle of these cliffs, which have protected it from the yearly fires. And so arriving was a sight I'll never forget. And yeah, here is the forest, sort of the expansive green spreading below after just 3 hours of that barren, dry landscape. So it was such a relief to get up, and it really took my breath away. But we quickly set up camp. You'll notice it looks like we were basically camping in the clouds, because we were. And that created for some really interesting weather. We also needed to have some armed officials reinforce our campsite, because we were staying in a region that has some history of conflict in the tribal groups that live in this region. So that was just for some reinforcement, but we quickly got set up and got very comfortable. And we basically lived like this for 11 days. And my tent is kind of out of view, but we used to eat all our meals right here, basically on the floor. And this is where we'd come back and rest after going out to hike to collect data. And so every day I spent in the Lost Forest, I would go out and collect these leeches, which were so abundant and so easy to collect. Yeah, there are plenty of them everywhere. And so this is kind of what they look like, and this is how they move. And it's my job to try to fit them into those little plastic baggies as quickly as I can. And then I take back the leeches that I've collected and I process them at camp. I sort of sort them out into different groups based on what they look like. And then I put them in preservatives for the trip back to New York. But even though I am hiking through the forest looking for leeches, every time you step foot in the forest, you see something new. And so these guys were some of my favorites. This is a rainbow milkweed locust, and this guy just stopped me dead in my tracks. I could not look away from this beautiful grasshopper. I mean, look at those red studs on the back. I had never seen anything like that. And here you'll see a black and red millipede on the right. You may be familiar with millipedes. They exist pretty much everywhere. In Madagascar, these are a bit bigger than the ones you've probably seen. And lemurs often will eat them and rub them all over their fur. And it's believed that millipedes release a toxin that helps protect them against parasites. So there may be some use to lemurs rubbing them all over themselves like that. Now, speaking of lemurs, someone else on my team was actually studying nocturnal lemurs. And so every night she would leave out these traps around tent and hope that, if she would catch a mouse lemur or a dwarf lemur, she'd leave bananas and other yummy treats in there. And sure enough, they had a couple of really good days. So this guy on the right here is a mouse lemur. You'll notice that it's being held. This is for scale. I just want you to see how tiny this primate is. This is one of the smallest primates in the world. It is the smallest primate in the world. And it's on the fingertips of a human man. And it's that tiny. And then down here we have a dwarf lemur who's also being held for some body measurements. And these specimens we were using them to get some genetic samples and some body morphics, and then they were released again once we were done with them. Also, another really exciting find was this giant land snail. And I want you to take a look at this gorgeous designer leopard print rim. This is a snail that's probably new to science. It's probably a new species. And we found a bunch of them at our camp. So we were really excited to collect some data on those snails. And then, of course, you have perhaps what are the island's most famous lemurs, the ring-tailed lemurs. And they're sort of the hook that got everyone interested in this forest, because they're only known to live in the western dry region. And so a local Malagasy woman notified researchers that there were these dry forest lemurs living in this wet rainforest. And that really sparked everyone's interest that hadn't ever been observed before. So that's really what got everyone flocking to this site and trying to figure out, why do these animals live here and what brought them here. Another really exciting find is this teeny tiny chameleon up in the right-hand corner. So what happened was I was sort of on my hands and knees. I had fallen trying to get out of the forest after a day of collection, and I'm kind of shuffling around in the understory. And suddenly I see a little leg peek out from under the leaves, and it's this little chameleon. And this also is looking like it may be a species new to science, which was really exciting. But chameleons come in all shapes and sizes, and Madagascar is home to the most diverse chameleons in the world. And so you've got some as tiny as this little guy up on my finger, to ones that are quite bigger. They can be up to the length of your forearm, if not bigger. And he's got these really neat little nasal horns. Speaking of chameleons, when you're not collecting data during the day, you're often going off on a night hike in the evening. At camp, you just spend as much time in the forest as possible. So after everyone would come back from their daily data collection, we would have dinner together and sort of get ready to go on a night hike. And chameleons are pretty easy to find in the evenings because they rest on the ends of branches and leaves, and that helps them escape predation. Say there's a snake that's crawling its way up a branch or up a tree, and a chameleon spots it, then the chameleon can easily just drop to the ground and get away safely before the predator can get to it. So when we're out for night hikes, we're always scanning the tips of leaves for chameleons, and we always find a good bunch. And this snake was a gorgeous boa that was shedding earlier during the day, and then someone at my camp found it out and active after it had finished shedding, and it had all this beautiful coloration after it was freshly shedded. And so all in all, I have to say that this expedition was a massive success. I collected 1,451 leeches total, which was more leeches than anyone had collected from any single site ever before. And by analyzing their gut contents, we'll soon find out what else lives in this forest. We came out of it with potentially 2 new species to science. You get a leech on your face, that's bound to happen. That's always a good day. So all in all, everyone was really thrilled by the results of this expedition, and I can't wait to get back.
That is amazing. That is absolutely amazing. We have so many student questions, and I want to try to get to as many of them as possible.
Great.
So I'm going to, let's just dive right into it.
Mm-hmm.
Tahina was really interested in what else leeches may eat, and a number of students were really interested in whether or not, I think this is out of concern for you, seeing all those leeches on your hand and on your body. Does it hurt? Do you just let them bite you? What else do leeches eat, generally speaking?
So I found that leeches feed on pretty much anything that moves and anything that they can get to. So I found that they feed on birds, lizards, snakes, mammals, frogs, you name it. And as far as whether or not they hurt, they don't really hurt at all. Usually what it feels like having a leech stuck onto your body is, it just feels like a cold droplet of water, which is funny working in a rainforest, because you always have to ask yourself, is it raining or am I covered in leeches? Because it could be either. But they really don't hurt at all. They do make you bleed a lot though, because they release these compounds called anticoagulants, which just make you bleed for a really long time so that they can get a good blood meal. But in regards to the number of different animals, I found a total of 42 different species that leeches feed on. So they feed on a whole lot of things.
Wow, fascinating. Speaking for myself, I haven't thought about leeches in that way before, and now I'm fascinated by them.
Yeah.
Donna would really like to know about the temperature and the climate of the Lost Forest. Was it cold? Was it hot? What was it like there?
So It was very cold. It was probably around 40 degrees on average, and plus wind that made it feel colder almost every day. And I actually have a story. Our camp, there was a cyclone that touched down at our camp during the time that we were there. And there were these gale force winds that were coming through camp. And it was literally unhinging a lot of the tents, and they were flying away, even with all that gear inside. And so what I had to do one day was, sorry, hang on. I had to fill my tent with these rocks. I had to go find rocks, pretty much the biggest rocks that I could carry, and stick them in my tent so that it wouldn't fly away in the middle of the night, even with me in it. And so one of the interesting things about this site is that it's sort of littered with these giant quartz crystals. And when you're hiking through the forest, it almost feels like you're hiking through a fish tank because you're stepping in this crystal gravel. So it's very bizarre. It's really beautiful. But yeah, those rocks came in handy that one time when our tents almost flew away because it was so windy.
Wow. Lucian would like to know if by putting the leeches in the bags, you're killing the leeches, and what you do with the leeches.
Yeah, so I have a little time lapse here to show you sort of exactly what happens once I bring them back to camp. They're not dead when I put them in the bag. You'll see at the end, I sort of pour out a liquid, a DNA preservative, and they sort of die relatively slowly in that preservative, sort of on their own. So I'm emptying out all the baggies here, and I can sort them out at camp based on what they look like to try to separate them out into species as much as I can. And then you sort of group them into little vials and you label everything. But they die once you sort of sort them out on this tray.
Right,
there
very
it is.
interesting. Yeah, great video.
Thanks.
Richard wants to know if leeches can climb high up in trees.
Yeah, they can. In fact, I have some friends who are frog researchers, which means that they have to climb all the way up to the canopy to get the data that they're looking for. And some of my friends have pretty horrifying pictures of leeches getting in their eyes 60 feet above the ground.
Wow. They're everywhere.
Yeah.
Jose Adriel was curious to know what it felt like to have a leech on your hand or on your body. I think it's fascinating that you live in New York in a very urban area, and you seem just as comfortable being in this forest and experiencing some of these very natural things. What does it feel like? What makes it possible for you to do that?
Well, leeches just feel like they're cold rain on your skin. They just feel kind of cold. But I'm so lucky to be able to do what I do and to be able to travel to Madagascar. And I really enjoy it. It's not for everyone. You kind of have to rough it a lot of the time, and you need a really positive attitude in the field because things always go wrong. And there's no time to get bogged down or frustrated by whatever's going on. So you really just have to turn a new leaf and get creative and figure out how you're going to get through it. So I enjoy that rush, and I always feel at home sort of when I'm outside. So it's really something I look forward to immensely, being in the field.
Very cool. Tahana wants to know if leeches sleep and how they reproduce. Do they have babies?
Yeah, I don't know if leeches sleep the way we would define sleep, but I know that once a leech has fed, and they can feed up to 7 or 8 times their own body weight. So once a leech has fed to completion and it's fully engorged, it's not going anywhere. They pretty much just stay put, they digest. They're not looking for another meal necessarily immediately. So yeah, they'll sort of rest to just digest. When you're out walking through the forest, leeches are usually sort of standing upright in what's known as a questing position. So they camouflage by staying very still until some movement comes and walks past them, and then they sort of latch on. So that's also sort of like a resting state, I guess. Leeches do have babies. Leeches are both male and female at the same time, which is kind of cool. And so, yeah, they don't, that's how they reproduce. They can lay an egg sac and have more leech babies.
Okay, there was some concern in the chat that removing over 1,000 leeches from the forest might have had an impact on the ecosystem. Does removing over 1,000 leeches from the forest leave an impact on the forest?
That's a great question. And I would have to say that at the rate that I was doing it, that's not an issue, especially since I'm the first person to collect that many leeches from that forest, and they are so abundant that I don't foresee that as being an issue at all. And in fact, just by virtue of there being so many leeches in the forest, it indicates that it's a very healthy forest because leeches prefer cold, wet environments. And you know, when the understory is cold and wet, it usually means that the canopy is intact to prevent a lot of sunlight from penetrating down. So the forest is very healthy. I know that because the understory was the perfect habitat for leeches. I know that because there were thousands more leeches that I didn't collect still left in the forest.
Great. Kimosaurus and Winston and a few others in the chat are wondering, what was your absolute favorite animal or animal encounter during your time in the Lost Forest?
I would have to say the chameleon that I found, that might be a new species. That was really exciting. So let me remind you what I'm talking about. It was this little green guy down in the corner. And I was so excited. I took these pictures and I ran back to camp to show everyone. And everyone couldn't believe their eyes, basically, that this little thing exists. And we basically spent the rest of the day trying to go back and find it, but we couldn't. And we spent all day combing the forest looking for chameleons that day, and it was a lot of fun. But yeah, that was a really exciting find. But I mean, even though I study leeches and I love invertebrates, I have a real soft spot for lemurs, and it's always exciting seeing a lemur, no matter what.
Lucian would like to know, on your thank you slide, your last slide, there's an animal at the top left side that looks surprised and curious about what that was.
Good question. So these are lemurs from throughout Madagascar. They're not necessarily found in the Lost Forest. And the lemur up top that looks surprised, this is actually an indri, and they are the largest living lemur species today. They're about the size of a German shepherd. They're found up in the northern forests, and they're charming. They're lovely. I got to see them this time. I stopped in the north on my way out of Madagascar, and they have these really haunting calls that they make in the morning. They sound kind of like whales. I would really recommend that you look up some sort of audio video to hear what they sound like, because they make these just amazing calls throughout the forest.
So cool, great question. I wanted to finish sort of on what you have found since you've gotten back to New York. What are you doing with your leeches? How did the leeches get home? And what are you hoping to find? Or what have you found?
Yeah, so the leeches, I got back from Madagascar on December 15th. The leeches themselves, all 1,400 of them, didn't make it to New York until February 15th. And that's just the fact of the matter. When you're doing field work in Madagascar, permitting is usually sometimes can be tricky to time. So I just had to wait for a colleague to come back from Madagascar with them in February. And so I spent a few months without them, which was sad because I was really eager to get started and figure out what else lives in this forest. But, you know, since having to be in quarantine and having my lab be closed, I haven't been able to really get at that question, but I'm so excited to get back to work and to figure out, you know, what else we can learn about the things that live here.
Fantastic. There's one more question I really want to get to because it's something I have on my mind too. Bridget in the chat is wondering if there were any large predators or any living thing in the forest that you were concerned about or worried about encountering.
No, I'm usually not worried about that, at least not in Madagascar, where the largest predator is the fossa, which I have a picture of right here. And it looks like a cat, but it isn't. It's more closely related to a mongoose. And they are found in the Lost Forest. I didn't see any or hear any, but I did have sort of an encounter back in 2017 when I was camping in Ranamafan National Park. And I remember there was one night where I heard a fossa chase down a lemur and hunt it from my tent, which was really crazy. And I couldn't believe what I was hearing. And it was kind of scary, but I wasn't scared for myself. It was just kind of a spooky sound to be listening in on.
Wow, amazing. I have one final question that we ask all of our participants. If you want to come on out of screen share, now might be a good time for that. When the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic is over and you're free to roam and continue your adventures, where are you hoping to go next?
That's not Madagascar.
It can be Madagascar if you want.
Well, yeah, I'll always have a spot in my heart for Madagascar, and there's plenty of questions to be asked about, the wildlife that lives there. But I'm really eager to explore some of mainland Africa. I sort of have an interest in exploring how biodiversity responds to areas of human conflict, and how conflict zones influence biodiversity. So that might be something that I look into potentially once this is all over.
Very interesting. I hope you get to do all of that and more very soon. That is all the time we have for today. This 30 minutes has just flown by. What an amazing discussion. I want to thank you so much, Mai, and thank you to our entire YouTube live stream audience for joining us today. Such great student questions. It was just really, really fun to learn more about Mai and her research. We have an amazing lineup of STEM-related live stream events left to go this week alone. And in just an hour or so, we're going to be talking with Kevin Hand, who's NASA's pre-project scientist for the Europa lander mission. And he's the director of the Jet Propulsion Lab's Ocean Worlds Lab, which I just can't wait to learn more about. He's about to begin, or he's in the middle of beginning, a search for life on other planets, which is really, really cool. I hope you'll come back and join us again then. And in the meantime, check out the complete calendar of events at athome.reachtheworld.org. Thank you again, Mai, and we'll see you all next time.
Thank you.